Welcome to our Social Equity Virtual Town Hall. We're so excited that you're here to join us for this great presentations that we have tonight by two very compelling and well-educated in this cannabis space. And we'll go ahead and introduce them as well. But again, I'm Glenna Colaprete. I'm the Social Equity Co-Chair. Excited to have other committee members with us tonight that are amazing. And I'm also an adjunct professor at FLCC. So welcome to some of my students that I see that are joining. And I'm also a cultivator myself, a hemp farmer, and 2 stores. So I'm excited for us to share our experience in the Social Equity Forum and hear from these esteemed presenters tonight. Feel free to post your questions in the question and answer section, and we'll go ahead and get started. So like I said, I'm a cultivator myself and definitely versed in what it takes to prepare a license, prepare a farm, prepare retail, all the compliance that's involved, and it's laborious but worth it. So we're here to try to take some of the sting out of that and ease some of those impedances, if you will, try to answer some of the questions, help bring you guys to fruition in this amazing space. Just a quick anecdote, when I first started growing, I felt like the townspeople all came to see what is happening here. Am I planting marijuana? What is going on? So they put this forum before the town board to discuss this. So I had to meet with the town supervisor, I had to meet with the townsfolk, and I set up where they could come view the plants, see that they were not marijuana, see that they were in fact hemp, and that albeit it might smell the same, it had a different level of THC, etc., and even show them some of the finished products. So by the end of that, they were all willing participants and supporters of the endeavor. And lastly, we did have a lot of visits from some police officers thinking that we were growing narcotics. So we had to disseminate my license to the sheriff and all the police officers within Livingston County. So there's definitely some things that our esteemed presenters today will help navigate some of that. So I'm excited you're here to join us. And without further ado, I'll introduce Carlos. Thank you, Carlos.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, Kristin, Rachel. My name is Carlos Runge Jr. I'm a member of the Social Equity Committee at the NYCGPA, and I know we are so excited to have you here tonight with us. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to participate. All right, I'm going to introduce Rachel Paddington now. Rachel Paddington is a land use, environmental, and municipal attorney with Knauf LLP in Rochester, New York. She is social media co-chair for the New York State Bar Association's Environmental and Energy Law section and serves as outside general counsel for Catskill Explorer, a transit-oriented development and smart growth organization. She's a graduate of the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law Real Estate and Land Use program and previously worked as a legal intern for the villages of Rochester and Assigning, and the general counsel for the Onondaga Nation. Additionally, Rachel is a disability advocate and founder of the Access for All Abilities program at Wells College, where she has guest lectured on accessibility and environmental justice. Hi, Rachel, thank you for coming. And we also have Kristin. Kristin, very long resume, very impressive. Where do I start, Kristin? All right. Founder and CEO of Park Jordan, a commercial real estate brokerage and advisory services firm serving the cannabis industry. She's also an attorney, drug policy activist, and thought leader. Until recently, Kristin served as the director of real estate at Acreage Holdings. In that role, Kristin led Acreage's efforts with regard to selecting real estate sites for the company's national footprint of cultivation, processing, and dispensary facilities, managing internal and external relationships, negotiating and administering leases. Prior to her work in the cannabis sector, she practiced real estate law at several boutique firms and managed real estate portfolios for Kaplan Inc., Morgan Stanley, and SoulCycle. Kristin's passion for advancing cannabis reform has extended to a variety of professional and nonprofit endeavors. Her work has won her the recognition of Forbes as one of the 15 powerful and innovative women in cannabis right now. Congratulations, Kristin. We're really lucky to have you. She's the founder and CEO of Manada, a New York City-based cannabis professional event production company, which launched The Maze, a weekly cannabis event listing newsletter. All right, Kristin, did I get all that? I think Glenna is going to start us off now.
Let me unmute. Yes, thank you for introducing them. And they both have amazing resumes and have done a lot of work in the advocacy of cannabis. So Rachel is going to start with a presentation regarding municipalities and zoning. I know that is a frequent question that we are asked about. How do I launch a business? What do I need to do? Again, we're geared more towards the social equity aspect. That's what our charter is of the committee, and what we could do to try to minimize some of these angst as far as where you're going to start your business, how you're going to start it, how to develop it in regards to different zoning and municipalities. So without further ado, Rachel, if you are ready, you can go ahead and share and present your presentation regarding those topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenna. I am ready. And thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. I am so excited to be speaking with all of you tonight and to be in the colleague of these fantastic panelists. So as we know, a lot of this is new right now, and I have done my best to summarize the MRTA for you, and I'll give you a brief overview of some of the highlights of the law. And I know my colleague here, Kristin, has extensive experience in this realm, so I will leave it to her if she wants to jump in on anything or add to anything I'm saying. And I'll share my screen. All right, can everyone see that? Yes, okay, I'm seeing head nods, we're good. Okay, so tonight we're gonna demystify some of the marijuana regulations and principally looking at the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. So although we don't have the New York State regulations out or license applications, there is plenty that we need to examine in the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. So in short, the law enacts Chapter 7A of Cannabis, 7A Cannabis Law. It significantly amends several other state laws, including penal, public health, and tax law, and it regulates the use, production, sale, and other activities related to cannabis and cannabis products. It restructures criminal penalties, cannabis use, possession, and sales. And it retroactively addresses past criminal offenses and provides opportunities for the resentencing and reclassification of convictions. It also uses tax revenue to benefit the state and targeted communities. So the use of cannabis is legal, and this is done under Penal Law Article 222 cannabis. This allows for use by adults ages 21 years and older, and it allows for possession of up to 3 ounces of cannabis and 24 grams of concentrated cannabis on your person. It allows for consumption and paraphernalia in addition to other provisions. I'm not a criminal attorney, but there is more that you'll want to look into as far as some changes here. So the law sets up the administration of our cannabis program. It creates the Office of Cannabis Management, which administers the program, and it creates the Cannabis Control Board, which most of you know had its first meeting yesterday. The Cannabis Control Board sets standards and requirements for cultivation, processing, packaging, and marketing, sales, etc. It also issues registrations, licenses, and permits as required. The law also creates the Cannabis Advisory Board. Now, the role of this board is to advise and issue recommendations on the use of cannabis products, and it also will administer the Community Grants Reinvestment Fund. So again, as many of you know, there had been some delay in confirmations for critical positions in administration, but now that we have Governor Kathy Hochul in office, these confirmations have all been made, and we now have the director of the Office of Cannabis Management, the executive director, Christopher Alexander, and we have the Cannabis Control Board that has been completed. We have Chairperson Tremaine Wright, and the other members, Jessica Garcia, Dr. Jen Metzger, Adam Perry, and Ruben R. McDaniel III. And we also now have the selection of Jason Starr, who will be the Chief Equity Officer. So some of the other provisions of the law is the huge state focus on diversity and small scale production. Also critical is the 50% goal for licenses going to minority or women-owned enterprises, distressed farmers, and service disabled veterans. There are a number of different licenses that you can apply for under this law, including cultivator, processor, distributor. And the law also extends the medical marijuana program through the registered organization licenses. We also have licensing for retail dispensaries and on-site consumption, and also some interesting categories such as a co-op license, microbusiness, nursery, and delivery. So again, although we do not, although we do not have the regulations out and the license applications, there are important provisions in the law. And one of them is a definition of what constitutes an applicant. So an applicant has a significant presence in New York State, either individually or by having a principal corporate location in the state, is incorporated or otherwise organized under the laws of the state, or is a majority of the ownership are residents of the state. Now, the law also defines person as meaning an individual, institution, corporation, government or governmental subdivision or agency, a business trust, estate, trust, partnership or association, or any other legal entity. The law also lists several different factors that will be considered as part of the licensing criteria. Now, the law does state that it is including but not limited to these factors, but it's still important to begin considering all of these as you begin to prepare for a license. So some of the factors considered are whether the applicant is a social and economic equity applicant. They'll also look to the ability to maintain effective control against illegal diversion or inversion, and also compliance with applicable state laws and regulations. They'll look to whether the applicant is ready, willing, and able to carry on activities, including with assistance to the Social and Economic Equity and Incubator Program, which hopefully will be a huge asset to New York State's program. They'll also look to whether the applicant has the right to use sufficient land, buildings, and equipment, or has a plan to do so if they're qualifying as a social and economic equity applicant. I think the law acknowledges that sometimes there can be significant barriers to obtaining sufficient land, buildings, and equipment. So if you are in that category, a plan can be sufficient. They'll also look to whether it sets out a plan for benefiting communities and the public that's been disproportionately impacted by enforcement of cannabis laws. This is important. And it also looks to whether there's a public interest that such license be granted. Now, for time's sake, I didn't list all of the factors that they include, whether there's a public interest, but to make a note of that is important. The law goes on to continue whether the applicant is of good moral character, and also whether they have no ownership or controlling interest in more licenses or permits that's allowed. So that's important because when you read the different license categories, there are certain restrictions on the ways that different operations can interact with one another, or the different ways that applicants can be involved with different license operations. The criteria also includes whether there has been a labor peace agreement signed, and also whether the applicant will contribute to communities and people disproportionately harmed by the enforcement of cannabis laws. And it lays out a social responsibility framework for examining this. Now, if you are going for an adult use cultivator or processor license, you'll also be looking to the environmental and energy impact, including compliance with energy standards. Now, they'll also look to whether the applicant satisfies any other conditions determined by the board, which we'll see in the near future. And in the case of a registered organization, they'll look to the organization's effort in manufacturing and or dispensing and or researching medical cannabis for certified patients and caregivers. So to delve a little bit more into the types of retail that we'll be seeing, I'm sure most of you know a bit about this already, but for those of you who don't, a retail dispensary will consist of storefronts to buy product for home consumption. We also will have retail on adult use consumption sites, and this consists of a lounge-like location for purchase and use on site. And we also have cannabis home delivery services planned for the future. So any fans out there of the show High Maintenance, we will be seeing this now legal and out in the open. Now, to examine a little bit of the taxation and economic impact, taxes generated will be deposited in a state cannabis revenue fund. There will be a THC excise tax. This includes 0.5 cents per milligram of flower, 0.8 cents per milligram of concentrated cannabis, and 3 cents per milligram of edible cannabis products. Now, after administrative costs, the remaining tax funds will be split between education, 40%, the community grants reinvestment fund at 40%, and drug treatment and public education at 20%. So keep that in mind every time you're buying, you are contributing to this. Now, it's estimated to be a $1 billion industry with 350 million revenues annually, and is also expected to create roughly 30 to 60,000 jobs. Now, retail sales will be subject to a 13% tax, and this is broken down into 9% for the state and 4% for local. Further broken down, 3% to the municipality and 1% to the county. Now, this is a very important part for municipalities. There's a provision in the law regarding opting out of retail and on-site consumption only. It's important to note that. Now, municipalities must adopt a local law subject to permissive referendum by December 31st of this year. If an opt-out is chosen, a municipality can opt back in at any time, but it's important to consider whether the municipality could be harmed by opting out and missing out on the businesses that will be coming in. If they're opting out, those businesses likely will go further on down the road to other municipalities, and then they could potentially lose out on the tax revenues if they decide to get back in later. Now, there are also other provisions within the law regarding what municipalities can do. And what they can't do. Municipalities can't prohibit adult recreational use or adopt any law or ordinance that essentially regulates the cannabis industry. That is the role of the state. Now, municipalities can amend zoning laws to address the time, place, and manner of operation of a licensed adult use cannabis retail dispensaries and or on-site consumption. Now, this can be done as long as the operation is not made unreasonably impractical. Now, the definition of this has yet to be determined, but this is something that will be in an instance of conflict determined by the advisory board. So it's also important to note that local laws adopted prior to March 31st of this year prohibiting cannabis use or businesses have no effect on opting out of retail sales. So if you have that law, this doesn't apply, you still need to pass that local law opting out, which is subject to the permissive referendum process. The law also has a strong focus on the environment and sustainability. It calls for the protection of the environment and resilience to climate change. It also has implications for the Clean Indoor Air Act, establishing where cannabis can be smoked or vaped similarly to tobacco. So don't be alarmed if you see someone smoking a cigarette and someone smoking a joint alongside them. The law also establishes regulations for a safe production of cannabis, including environmental and energy standards and restrictions on the use of pesticides. It also will be establishing best practices for the uses of water and energy conservation, which, as we know, is really important in cultivation and processing. It will also develop regulations for use by the office in assessing applications for licenses, including the ability to increase climate resiliency and minimize or eliminate adverse environmental impacts, including but not limited to water usage, energy usage, carbon emissions, waste, pollutants, harmful chemicals, and single-use plastics. So again, this is a very brief overview of the law, but I hopefully captured some of the important highlights. But again, it's important to look at the law in its entirety. So if you have questions, reach out to a consultant, organization, attorney, etc., who can guide you through it. I will pause the share on my screen and give my time back to Carlos here.
Thank you so much for that. Wow, that was really comprehensive. I want to remind everyone in our audience to drop questions in the chat room. Actually, we have a question section. Please drop them there, but in the chat, please feel free to share your comments. We have so much to cover from this PowerPoint, but I also want to give Kristin a chance to perhaps chime in on that presentation.
Sure. I think Rachel gave a wonderful overview and sort of set the table, excuse me, for our discussion. So appreciate that, Rachel. I know that took a lot of work putting that together. You know, I'm excited for this conversation because I think it's important for us to start talking about what this will look like. I think for so long, we've all sort of had new concepts, what legal cannabis would look like, but we've not had the opportunity to actually get in the nuts and bolts and talk about the nitty gritty. And I think specifically, we're really excited about talking about social equity applicants and what that might look like. As Rachel alluded to, you know, the legislature is very firm in their stance in supporting small businesses and people of color and prioritizing, frankly, marginalized communities that have been impacted by racially biased enforcement of drug policy over the, since the 70s. It's my understanding that in the early 70s, we actually looked at legalizing in New York State, but unfortunately it didn't happen there. So this is a long haul that I know people like Assemblyperson Dick Gottfried has been fighting since the 70s. And so, you know, my short time of advocacy in the 7 years that I've spent doing this is just, it pales in comparison to the folks who've been doing this for a long time. And certainly we can't forget to acknowledge and sort of pay homage to the folks who've literally given their lives and their wealth and communities and, you know, suffered terrible consequences as a result of this racially biased enforcement of drug policy. And so I think it's time for us to correct those wrongs, for us to address those issues, and for us to prioritize addressing that harm, both by creating pathways for job opportunities and, community reinvestment. But more importantly, in my mind, it is also a pathway to create generational wealth. unlike any other industry that we've seen, any other nascent industry, technology, real estate, name the industry. There's never been a pathway for marginalized people to have true ownership. And so I think this is a tremendous way for us to think about this industry for marginalized people, not only people impacted by the war on drugs, but marginalized people generally here in New York, small business owners, women who have lack of access to capital oftentimes. There are so many marginalized populations that can benefit from the business opportunities. And let's not forget to mention all of the other harms that have been addressed in the bill. Folks who are dealing with child protective services no longer have to feel threatened by cannabis consumption. It's treated just like alcohol consumption. So things like that, automatic expungements. It's my understanding that after the bill was signed by the governor on April 1st, there were cheers throughout prisons around the New York State area. And I mean, that just gives me chills to think about the potential opportunities for folks that have faced these traumas inflicted by our government. So I'm really excited for this conversation.
Fantastic response, Kristin. And you bring up a great point about the expungement clinics. I know Senator Cooney had one in Rochester recently. I know Crystal Peoples-Stokes has had one in Buffalo. So those expungement clinics are going on across the state. And to your point, it's fantastic and about time, frankly. So you brought up some great points about racially biased, marginalized, women, generational wealth, trying to correct the harm, if you will, right? It's not always targeted to certain individuals. So I'd like to hear more about that. Also, I want to ask a question in regards to Rachel. When you talked about municipalities and roadblocks and such, what kind of documents do you guys foresee that a municipality might require as far as, an applicant in order to make sure that local laws are being applied evenly? Have you guys worked with different towns? Do you foresee what that process would entail for those that are on the call today?
Yeah, sure. So I am a municipal attorney. I represent towns and villages. And, right now we're at an interesting point because we are updating the local laws, but it's difficult to do without further guidance. We need to see the regulations because that's going to be an important part of where operations can be allowed, everything that we need to look at. But just knowing what we know from other states, and just the general licensing, permitting process, it's common practice for people to meet with a municipality and do what's called a pre-application meeting. And that's your opportunity to present your plans to the town, city, or village and walk through all of the requirements for making those plans happen. And so I know that some municipalities have looked at requiring a special permit for retail, for growing, processing, all of that. And it will be common that you would need to have some type of site plan showing what will be taking place on site, and making sure that you can do it within the proper zoning district. It's a real issue sometimes where people purchase real estate without having their plans in place and working with the municipality first. I'm sure Kristin can attest to that. If you purchase the site and then try to come into or change, get a zoning variant, that's very problematic. So again, another reason why you want to reach out early and have that meeting. And some places, bigger municipalities really formalize the pre-application review process, but if you don't see that as part of their requirements, still reach out to have that meeting. It's important.
You bring up a great point because let me just make sure I'm unmuted. I get this question a lot. If I want to start a dispensary, or if someone wants to start a delivery service, or whatever they want to do, they want to go ahead and sign a lease. They want to kind of put that cart before the horse, if you will, and start incurring overhead costs, right? And we would caution for a multitude of reasons, right? So I think if you can maybe just quickly, succinctly, Kristin and Rachel, as far as what's the first step you should take once you denote, hey, I'd like to do a dispensary. Like you said, don't go and get a lease, especially in a town that's going to opt out, right? So
Right.
what would that entail as far as that first kind of planning session with yourself and then maybe with an attorney? How
Yeah.
do you address that?
From my perspective, from a real estate brokerage perspective, I think the first thing to do, excuse me, is to do your market research, to really understand what it is you intend to do. I think a lot of folks, especially clients that I'm dealing with, just think everybody's going to buy their cannabis, and they've not really given thought to who their customer is, who their client base is, and how they're going to market it. Look. Cannabis is ubiquitous at this point, and so that the type of consumer varies depending upon your form factor, of course, and that comes into play a lot. So if you intend to be, for instance, a beverage distributor, you would want to think about, what that client looks like, and do your market research and figure that out. And from a real estate standpoint, you would want to take those demographics and overlay them on the state of New York and figure out where your demographics lay. And to Rachel's point, I would suggest that in advance of the regulations and the application process, to really understand what's going on in that city center, in that municipality, to meet your stakeholders, to find out who your zoning board and your planning board representatives are, to really fully understand what that process is. I mean, in New York City, it's very different than in Syracuse, New York. And those elected officials are different folks, and the hurdles that you'll have to go through are different. So in advance of the regulations, really understanding where you want to be, understanding who those stakeholders are, and quite honestly, potentially educating your local folks, because we still are looking at that December 31st clock of opting out opportunities for retail and on-site consumption in municipalities. And we're seeing, I think I read recently in the town of Manlius, which is not too far from where my family lives, local folks actually rose up. I think it was an attorney who decided to challenge the opt-out and got signatures. And so really it is a grassroots effort of getting your town together to educate folks. Now, while unlike some of the other states that once a municipality opts out, there's a waiting period and you can't opt back in, I think what I'm hearing, especially from other consultants, is that communities in New York are a little bit trepidatious, they're a little bit nervous, they don't know what this is. And so they're, rather than allowing businesses, they're opting out preemptively and want to wait because they know that they can opt back in. Well, from a real estate perspective, I would suggest that, the way that I'm going to look at that is that there's going to be a real great opportunity in the neighborhood next door to where the opt-out is. And so we're going to make a concerted effort to make sure that we are populating that with cannabis businesses. And it would be challenging for newcomers who will come late to the party after they've opted out. And when the municipality comes back in, they'll be late to that party. And it'll be hard for those retailers to build an audience, especially with delivery being an option. So from that perspective, I think, getting your team together, finding out what municipality makes the most sense, really honing in on who your client base is and what your envelope is going to look like, sourcing your team, figuring out who your local contractors are, who your expediters are from a real estate perspective, and really understanding what that looks like.
Kristin, I should mention, is also a member of the New York State Bar Association Committee on Cannabis and the Minority Cannabis Business Association Policy Committee. Thank you for breaking down for us. I understand things a little bit clearer now myself too. Kristin, we have a question from the audience. Also, Rachel, feel free to chime in. How are municipalities making informed decisions on zoning and opting in or out? Much like hemp, I assume this would be our job to educate planning boards, our audience asks.
Yeah, as I just said, I think it is our job and our obligation to inform folks, because we are the ones who care about this industry and we're the ones who gain the benefit from it. In addition, obviously, to the patients and consumers who will purchase the products. But I'm not aware, Rachel. Maybe you have better insight because you're closer to how municipalities make those decisions. I don't have insight into that.
Sure. So we're doing a lot of training. Actually, when I did land use consulting at the Pace Land Use Law Center, that was really important with medical marijuana, because a lot of times people just don't understand. They don't know what it entails. They don't know what to expect. And you want to be able to educate them before they make any decisions. And especially with something like this, I saw a lot of people or a lot of municipalities doing moratoriums on things like fracking and waiting for further research on this. But really with cannabis, it's not the same thing. We don't need to wait on longer studies on environmental impacts. It's not as quite as complex. So we really try to do, training is common for planning boards and zoning boards on any type of subject. So I've done several training sessions, and we've also discussed doing town hall, village hall, city hall meetings, so that people can learn more about it, and then you can get an impression of what your what your residents are concerned about or excited about. And that is a great opportunity for this organization or anyone who's in the community to step up and give their perspective. And also, there was another point I wanted to make, that you want to be very cautious as you're proceeding, because if you have any issues with the municipality, any violations, it can go on your record when you're applying for a license, and the law states that. And so, another reason, like we've been saying, to have that initial meeting. But I know from my personal perspective that a lot of the municipalities are open to it. They are just on a bit of a learning curve. Not all of them. Some people are very informed, but that training and hearing input from people who are in the industry is crucial. So, you can reach out to planning departments. You can reach out to the supervisor's office. They will all be, for the most part, receptive to learning more.
One more comment. So some of the feedback that we get for rationale for why municipalities might consider opting out is that there's a fear that residential housing values will go down. I think the analogy is to liquor stores that had gone into certain communities. And actually the empirical evidence that we have available to us from states that have adult use is actually the opposite. That because of the highly regulated nature of these businesses, there's more law enforcement presence, security presence. These operators understand what the perception is and go out of their way to make sure that none of that actually happens. So we see housing values actually increase in municipalities where adult use has come.
Yes, that's something we've discussed as well, because even though we don't have these regulations out, and they will be very detailed, we already have a lot of criteria in the law. And when when the Cannabis Control Board is examining your application, they're going to look to factors like noise control. Is this going to increase noise in your community? They're looking at safety concerns. They're looking at whether the applicant has had any type of past violation operating a business or operating a cannabis business in another jurisdiction. So they're really controlling upfront the type of establishment that is going into your town, city, or village. So that initial screening process, I think, will be huge. And then we're only going to see more of that from the regulations and from what I've seen. A lot of the dispensaries, I hear it compared to the Apple stores a lot. They're sophisticated operations, and you have to be a certain amount of distance from the street, and you'll have times of operation, and it's not at all in the nightmare that people are concerned about, and as Kristin said, can be a true asset to a municipality. And again, this is you can only opt out of retail and on-site consumption. That is very important for people to understand.
Yeah, I was going to say that, Kristin. I know there's a question from the audience in regards to about cultivation and developing a relationship with the municipalities. So that's a little different scope than as far as a retail, customer user interface. So if you could just expound upon, what that would look like, maybe a little bit about the pre-meeting or the planning if someone's just going to do cultivation.
Cultivation gets a little bit tricky because retail, it's just a box, right? And with some security overlays and regulatory process. For cultivation, it's tricky because there are several different ways for which you can grow. I've seen at my former job at Acreage, we had, I think, 6 different types of operations and ways in which we cultivated cannabis. So I almost hesitate to suggest that anyone should be having these conversations with municipalities only because we don't know what the canopy size is. So we have no idea what we're looking at here. And so you might be looking at a small piece of property in a municipality and going down the road of, having that conversation only to find out that you're entitled to a much larger canopy, which would, predict where not predict, but inform where your location would be. And I think the thing to recognize is that in terms of the cultivation activity that everyone is reading about in New York, the 3 cultivators that acquired property recently are all medical operators. So they know that they already have a license. I am not hearing of any activity for potential cultivators yet because we don't know what the canopy size is. So, the GTI and Cresco, both of those are current medical operators, but neither of them have cultivation. They're currently wholesaling all of their product from the other 8 operators. So that made a whole lot of sense for both of them to take space. And I think they're in Orange County and Ulster County. Cresco's in Ulster. Pretty sure the GTI is in Orange County or Columbia, I forget which, forgive me. And then the 3rd operator, also medical, is Columbia Care, and they took property in Riverhead, which is also co-located near one of their dispensaries. So I'm not exactly sure what that game plan is, whether they intend to operate that, plus I think they're currently cultivating in Rochester. Rachel, is that right? Out of
That's correct.
An old Kodak building, right? Yep. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if they intend to close that down and relocate their operation, or if there's going to be an opportunity for both. But the only activity that I'm seeing is current operators who already hold licenses. And even potential new operators, multi-state operators who understand this process and potentially could be active in the market, they're really not. They're not out there until and unless we see the regulations, because quite honestly, they're savvy enough to know that we need those regulations in order for them to site the properties appropriately. But when that happens, there will be a mad dash to start those conversations with those municipalities, because the number of jobs that a cultivation and a processing facility brings to that community far outweighs what a retail operation could do. And so those conversations and conversations around incentives and entitlements and things for which you can partner with the municipality on, those conversations will happen, I would imagine, immediately after the regulations drop. Rachel, you probably have keener insight into that than I.
Yes, I completely agree with that. It's really difficult to know what kind of operation you can do until you have those final local laws, and they're amending zoning districts, what's allowed in different ones. And an interesting thing I have seen municipalities do in this initial stage is start to identify some of their neighborhoods and areas that have been impacted by cannabis prohibition. And so I know that like the city of Rochester has developed a cannabis task force. It's early, but they are examining municipal properties or properties they know that have been abandoned and vacant that they think would be great candidates for licensed cannabis operations. And it's I think will be a wonderful tool to begin rebuilding some of these neighborhoods. And if that's your initial conversation with the municipality, just from my experience, I know that you're on a good track with them. And you could potentially get a letter of support that you can submit along with your license application. And so like I said, I'm seeing some interesting things that municipalities have done in this stage before regulations are out. So if you are in that, if that is something that impacts you, you want to look in these neighborhoods, you want to learn more about them, that's something where a municipality is a great resource as well. And also talk to community organizations. They do a lot of this work all of the time. So they'll also be a great resource.
Thank you, Rachel. That was so helpful. There is another question from the audience. Great presentation, Rachel. Would you touch upon which licenses can be paired with another license type and restrictions of that?
So you know what, there is a lot there that I won't go into detail right now, but as I mentioned, it is important to read it. It's right in the law. Like, I'll give an example. You can't be a cultivator and also have a retail operation. The law really is aimed against vertically integrated operations. So you know, like I said, it would take me a bit of time to go through all of that, but it's right there in the law. You'll understand immediately, and also pay attention to you know, what types of interests may be allowed in different licenses. So you know, there could be an issue there'll definitely be an ownership issue if you have some type of ownership interest in, you know, in a cultivation and retail, but also for certain ones, if you do cultivation and distributing and it's not part of that license, there will be, you can have a cultivation license and have some limited processing and distributing on site. So again, I'm not going to go through all of it here because there's a lot, but pay attention to those restrictions. They're right in the law. You can see it now.
Thank you, Rachel. I know that we get asked that question a lot, like, which license do you go for? So if you do want to do a little processing or distributing of your own grow, you know, you do go for that cultivator license, and you can distribute your own products, but you couldn't be a broker for, let's say, someone else. You couldn't distribute other people. So there's definitely be rules and regs, you know, denoting that. You both brought up some great points about maybe some big cannabis, you know, ROs, and what those impacts and challenges and concerns might be. Obviously, they have some legacy aspect in this space. And to your point, already are vertically integrated, most of them here, at least. So sorry if you hear my dogs, they just came in to say hello too. But if you could touch on some of the challenges that you envision the big cannabis ROs might impact to social equity or to the smaller cultivators.
So I think just generally big cannabis companies and you know, I think at this point to put them all in the same boat is probably unfair. MSOs are very different in the way that they operate, in the way that they have evolved and grown over time. You've got multi-state operators, you've got single state operators like True Leave that really stay within their states and grow organically as opposed to through acquisition. The company that I worked for, Acreage Holdings, was more of an acquisition play nationally. So they're very varied in the way that they operate, the way that they conduct themselves. But I think, you know, the general feeling is that, you know, they're the antithesis to small operators and to small business owners. You know, I think I have a nuanced thinking about that, not only because I've worked for an operator, but also because, you know, I have a different vantage point in looking at the way that New York is going to roll out. I do believe that there is a place for the medical operators and for the multi-state operators in our state and to help with supply, especially on the front end. I know smart people would disagree with me, but you know, there is a concern that like states like Illinois and other states that, you know, on day one when we open our doors, that we won't have enough product on shelves, and that becomes a real issue, especially because the retail licenses are likely going to be will be less capital intensive, and so likely will be more attractive to social equity and small business owners as opposed to cultivation or processing. And so, you know, I think there's a perceived threat that the medical operators will sort of cannibalize the marketplace. I would suggest, however, that there's only 20 dispensaries that are currently open and operating, 40 dispensaries that are currently open and operating under the medical program. And so, you know, we're not at the saturation level, certainly not with 40 dispensaries. We're a state of 20 million people. I mean, if you go to any legal state, Denver, for instance, Vegas, there are dispensaries, you know, multiple dispensaries in the same area. And so I don't see that perceived threat as being realistic, especially on the front end, and especially in light of the regulators that were chosen to regulate the program. They're very conscious of that. They're very aware. Tremaine Wright, our chairwoman, is a small business owner. She is from Bed-Stuy. She understands the issues and the concerns of small business owners in this space. So I would be shocked and surprised if there weren't regulations that reflected that sort of mindset from our regulators. Another thing that I think about, and I take lessons from my friend Jason Ortiz, who's been advocating for legalization in Connecticut and was the former president of NYCGPA. He reminds me constantly that it was the state that is the actor that put our folks in jail. It is the state that created marginalized people in under-resourced communities. It is the state that allows for big businesses to operate in the way that they do here. And so I would look to the state to be the ones to protect and to uplift and create space for small businesses and for New Yorkers specifically.
And Kristin, correct me if I'm wrong, the Cannabis Control Board can give guidance on how many licenses they think should be issued in a particular category, right?
Yes, I am hearing noise that likely we will be a limited license state. I think that's a foregone conclusion. But you know, listen, the regs aren't written, and you know they are certainly looking for input. And you know, just understanding the nature of how Governor Hochul is conducting herself, and you know the folks who work under her administration, I can imagine that they are looking for feedback and would like to hear from folks as to how to roll this out. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. We have a different governor who actually listens.
Mm-hmm.
And great input there. I had a couple more questions that we've received in regards to, you touched on a lack of access to capital, as well as maybe people that don't want to be labeled a social equity applicant, but, you know, or maybe they have a disability or there's a hospitality aspect, you know, but they're still in a minority state, if you will. How do you, you know, maybe we can kind of end on that aspect as far as some specificity regarding some of the social equity, you know, capital play or labels, if you will.
No, I think look, the task ahead of the regulators is monumental. We don't have a roadmap for a successful social equity program in any state, period. Massachusetts was the first state that tried to do it on the state level. We've seen municipalities in California try to do this on the local level. But you know, Massachusetts had its own challenges. We're looking at lawsuits for delivery. We're looking at zoning issues that you know, push retail into frankly dingy and industrial areas that are not attractive for typical retailers. We've also seen graft and corruption. I believe the Fall River mayor is in jail as a result of some activities along those lines. So local control is concerning, but is an example for which I know our regulators understand and will try to prevent. So I think more than anything, we've got a roadmap of what didn't work. And from that, they'll be able to glean, hopefully, a pathway towards an equitable program. And look, I have full faith in Chris and Tremaine. If they are not able to come up with an equitable solution, they will wait. we are not impatient people here in New York. We waited 7.5 years. Dick Gottfried has waited 30 some odd years, 50 years, I believe it is. So we are patient people, and we want to get this right.
Kristin, thank you so much for that. And thank you for touching on the relationship between small operators and larger organizations that may have more access to resources and capital. What are your thoughts on the thought that ROs are not needed to supply the market at this point? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I'm not a processor or a grower, or a cultivator, so that is not my lived experience, and I don't have that experience. I try to be informed by what I see in other states and be guided accordingly. But I absolutely know that there are very intelligent people within this organization that feel very strongly that the ROs are not necessary. But the fact of the matter is they're here, and they're not going anywhere, and the law allows them to be here. So, you know, we either live with them and work with them, or we constantly battle. And quite honestly, you know, I trust the regulators to understand what the push and pull is here. And I think the choice of the regulators signals to New Yorkers that these things matter. Right. That's what gives me hope. Exactly, right.
Absolutely. What do you think about the barriers that small and mid-scale cultivator licensees face? And how do you think those ROs negatively impact these small businesses?
You know, not being a processor or cultivator, it's not my lived experience, so I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question. I'm sure there are folks that feel very strongly about how the medical market impacts other folks. I mean, listen, it's clear that you know, the ROs that we have today, the registered organizations, that's what that stands for, that they are predominantly white, male-led. You know, many of them are not New Yorkers. Many of them are out of state. Many of the operators, the current operators, purchase their licenses. There is a feeling about that, no question. You know, I'm not judge and jury. I don't have that purview. But I know there are very intelligent people, cultivators, who currently would disagree that we don't need them. But again, where I come down is the law allows them to be here and to also thrive alongside us. And for me, I'm so concentrated in making sure that small business operators, that women, that marginalized people, that communities of color can participate, that's just noise to me. We need to make sure that the regulations work for the subset of folks that I care about.
Exactly. And I had a couple of thoughts on that. Just speaking generally about the barriers and working with social equity applicants and, you know, capital, all of that. I'm getting a lot of questions from people who say, you know, I qualify as a social equity applicant, or I have plans to operate in this neighborhood that's been impacted. They have, you know, incredible plans along that terrain, but they're concerned about this sustainability aspect too, and the environment, because, you know, especially if you're talking about cultivating, processing, that can be very energy and, you know, water intensive. So I'm hoping that regulators, in keeping in mind some of these barriers, will have a very fluid definition of sustainable, you know, commitment to sustainability and climate resiliency. And I would like to see some more language about commitments to environmental justice. You know, if you have an applicant, maybe they're not using solar panels, or even LED lights might be cost prohibitive, but they're working on, you know, they're working in a community. Actually, I should back up. For definition of environmental justice, that's the idea that all people should be sharing the burdens and benefits of the environment equitably, which unfortunately is not the case. So you know, from my perspective, I really would like to see regulators being open to work done in that space as well, and that being constituted as environmental work.
I see one question that I'd love to just address because I have personal interest in it. I've seen a couple places that folks are asking about whether or not non-binary people will be included as LGBTQ members and such. It's my understanding that non-binary is not necessarily a protected class of people. So I don't think that it will qualify. However, there's a lot of attention to, who is actually a social equity applicant. And I would suggest that, rather than us picking apart other groups that are within the confines of social equity applicants, so women, people of color, low income people, the classifications that are currently in the bill, they still need to be defined. And so we don't know what that looks like. But the fight is, again, not amongst each other, but the fight is with the state to make more room for more people. I think there's a big miss on not including Indigenous people in this population, disabled people generally, not just disabled veterans. And I'm hopeful that either legislatively or some other workaround that we'll be able to address those populations to also participate in the industry as well.
Excellent. I think we also have a question about the square footage requirements for a micro business. We're still waiting for the rules and regs for specificity as far as canopy and what denotes, a craft license versus a micro versus a small cultivator versus a larger cultivator. So as the rules and regs come out from this new board, we'll see some of that specificity to answer that question live. Because I know I get that question a lot too. So more to come on that.
Right.
Thank you both for addressing, maybe sometimes difficult conversations, but being so open and transparent, as far as what we know, what we don't know. We have a vested support in that this new board that is represents a lot of people on the call, a little more equitably, hopefully. And that we have faith that they will come up with some, fair rules and regs. But how do you feel about, non-social equity applicants? I know we haven't touched on that much. I know we did. There's a lot of great things about social equity, but what if someone maybe even is potentially in a protected class, if you will, but maybe they want to go the non-traditional route and not necessarily a social equity route? What would you state about that as far as potential licensed operators?
Listen, we need everybody to participate. I mean, this is not just license holders. This is also the picks and the shovels. We talk about that all the time as well. I mean, we want this to be not only the gold standard for cannabis, but we want this to be a real industry that really takes hold and really reshapes New York State. I mean, we want to be the leader in all things cannabis and hemp.
And there are a lot of opportunities to show, if you aren't a social equity applicant, that you support social equity. So if you have a plan in place, maybe you're committing to hire people who are, defined as a social equity applicant, a certain percentage. Maybe you're doing jobs training. I think there are a lot of opportunities there. Or as Kristin mentioned, if you aren't in that defined category, but in a sense, it is part of social equity. If you're a person with a disability or another category that's been looked over, you can still incorporate that into your plans. Because I'm speaking to disability specifically, I know a lot of people with disabilities go to cannabis because of issues with that chronic pain, all kinds of things that it helps with. So we don't want to overlook that. And again, we're in an important place right now where you can give input to the boards, to the Office of Cannabis Administration, push for that.
Well, I'm so grateful for organizations like the New York Growers and Processors Association for creating that space to have these conversations, and also for regular people to put in to give input. I know the board at the Growers Association has produced white papers and has direct contact with Albany and really can help amplify the voice of the small grower and the small processor.
Well said. I think that was one of the questions too. How do we give input to the regulators? Michelle, I know that you had that question. So we're definitely, this group is putting white papers together. You can give comments and feedback to us. You can participate in town halls like this. A lot of the team is putting together in-person events that you guys can participate in. We're interested in bringing people that support, a seed to sale effort, if you will. So there's a lot of aspects to not just filing your LLC, but your plans, how you're going to grow, maybe a hydroponics store, maybe it's an accountant, because there's certain impacts with I-80E, of course, some IRS tax aspects. There's marketing, there's branding, as Rachel and Kristin touched on. So it's a very collaborative space, and that's the interest of this committee, is to, bring up some of these issues and impacts that would impede you from getting ramped up and started and hitting that supply of those 20 million people that you referenced, Kristin. So I think you'll see a lot more events coming from this team, both virtually and in person. I know there's a New York State Cannabis Expo on October 17th. I know we're putting together an event October 27th in Rochester. We're open to feedback. We're open to what we don't know, as far as diving into next topics, other marginalized populations, if you will. We want to hit it hard. We want to be open. We want to be transparent. We want to be participatory and try to right some wrongs wherever we can, if you will. And if we can't, let other people that do have this power, these stakeholders, the CCBs and stuff, let them know that those people exist, that we exist, and this is what we're looking for. So the comments coming in and questions are amazing. So I don't know if you guys want to touch on some of these live comments that we have from Kyle or James, if you guys want to. We have about 8 of them that are pending, so we could just leave it for question and answer.
I'm not exactly sure what James means here. What if a social equity applicant qualifies for multiple sections? Will that give extra priority? We don't know how the applications are going to be scored yet. There are varying ways that we've seen across the country the scoring happen and not happen well. If anybody's following what's happening in Illinois, they hired I think KPMG for a few $1 million, and they misscored the applications recently in Illinois, and so that's caused a big kerfuffle. We don't know yet. We're hopeful that they choose something that's going to work for us.
Oh, I see a question on contact information for the Rochester Task Force. No, they have assembled and they've started their work, but we have yet to hear how to contact. But I did hear from the planning commissioner that they plan on holding meetings and workshops and hopefully having a database even to evaluate some of the real estate and improve access to that. So stay tuned for that. I will be posting that information.
Rachel, I actually have a question for you. I know your experience is in environmental law, and I would love to hear your thoughts a little bit about pesticides, the use of pesticides in the cannabis industry, and how do you think that will look like in the regulation formation process? I know that's something many people are talking about, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Sure. So full disclosure, I'm not an expert on pesticides. I will say I know someone who is fantastic with that. Telesport Savage is an attorney, and he's with the New York State Bar Association's Cannabis Committee. So he will be talking in Albany at the New York Cannabis Exposition. So we'll be speaking on a sustainability panel. So stay tuned for that. But that is a very important consideration because it spells that out in the law. So again, it's a little difficult to know how they're going to evaluate different products and whether they'll be required to use pesticides that are more natural or not. We don't know right now without the regulations.
Great. Yes. We've lots to learn. What is your opinion of how pesticides may affect social equity applicants now with the differing amounts of capital needed for different types of operations?
I think that's such a good question because it applies not only to pesticides, but like I was saying, a lot of different environmental technologies. So, as I was saying, I'm hoping that we'll see an effort from the state to, to educate people on different technologies and practices. They're beneficial to the environment and climate resiliency, but also I would love to see the social incubator program assist people with that as well. So whether it's getting a loan for solar panels or, just educating people about some cheaper environmental technology. So, using LED lights, that can be a huge benefit. I'm also, I do a lot of work on grants. And so I'm hearing that there'll be more assistance with that and for some specific technologies. So if you're trying to find a system that handles gray water management, water reclamation systems. I think that we will see some funding assistance for that from what I'm hearing, and I'm very excited about it. And as I mentioned, I'm really hoping that they have a broad definition of what constitutes environmental work and sustainability. Like I said, I think that environmental justice work is so important. And so, if you're even working on establishing a retail business in a community that has, has had environmental issues in the past, and now you're including a new business that will not add to the environmental burden of that community. I think that should be considered worked on to environmental progress.
Well said, Rachel, because I know we heard, if you listen to the CCB board talk, that was one of the scopes that they'll look at as far as the sustainability. I think that might be a forgotten element as far as people preparing for their licenses. And it's the right thing to do, right?
Yes. And I know Jen Metzger has done a lot
Right.
of work in that sphere. I've worked with her a little bit.
I think, and to add to your point, I think, Kyle, you had that question in regards to, I know we touched on it briefly, Kristin, in regards to disabled veterans, potentially in the hemp cannabis space in New York State. I know, Rachel, we've talked about that too, where there's a lot of VA regulations, and how does that affect, the benefits? And I know in the MRTA, it's outlined service disabled vets, not necessarily just vets, if you will. So that question that Kyle brought up, do you see anything in regards to social equity with vets expounded potentially?
I don't know. I'll be honest, I don't know where we're going with that. In terms of like receiving benefits as opposed to looking at the industry, look, there needs to be a lot of changes, within the VA administration. But I'm not sure where that can go without the end of federal prohibition. I don't have enough insight into how we do that or accomplish that without doing that. But listen, there are some amazing veterans who have disabilities and who are actively operating in the hemp space. My friend Sarah Stenoff, who I mentioned the other day, has Veterans Ananda in Fulton, New York, and she operates a therapeutic space or acreage where she treats and helps disabled veterans therapeutically through different therapies and also through the growing of cannabis, of hemp. So there are some really amazing things happening in the space by and with veterans.
And unfortunately, to your point, with the the federal aspect and the banking laws, it's really impeded. I know personally, as far as trying to get merchant services or supporting your business, even with hemp, or CBD, a lot of banks are reticent for getting in that space. So obviously there's a lot at stake on the federal level to help propel that. I know Schumer has been a big proponent of that as well. So obviously we're looking at that. But hopefully, to circle back to both your comments about there potentially being capital, or low cost loans or ways to help get people started in this space, in the social equity realm. I know James, I know you had a question in regards to extra priority for licensing for those that were marginalized. I know, Kristin, you had some great comments about maybe, you know, zip codes or location based? How does gentrification impact that, and what high school you went to, if you will? If you could expound on that, on maybe some ideas and how they would get prioritized.
Yeah, you know, we've seen different municipalities do it differently. Some are subject to lawsuits, and others are more successful in the way that they're categorizing. So we've seen some municipalities choose zip codes and certain periods of time for which over policing and under resource for those communities was apparent. Attending certain high schools during certain times. I know, listen, in New York City, where I am, there is concern about the gentrification of Brooklyn. And so what is that going to look like? Are the new folks who are inhabiting Williamsburg going to be eligible? Probably not. I think both Tremaine and Chris are savvy enough to understand what the intentions of the bill are for. And I think James's question touches a little bit on intersectionality and the idea that, you know, one person may fit multiple buckets. I don't expect to see additional prioritization for that. The intention is for anybody who fits any of those categories to be able to participate. So I would be surprised, but again, I am not the regulator.
Thank you for that. I know we have actually a committee member. I don't know if he's on right now, Alexis, but he's down in Brooklyn, and he's putting together an event in the beginning of November. So maybe there'll be some insight into that as well, so we can help facilitate a little more information regarding that too, to your point, as some rules or regs or some other opportunities come out as far as how they're gonna delineate and correlate some of those impacts to certain locations or certain people. Any other questions that you guys have? I know you guys have talked a lot and said some great things and presented a bunch. I know there's still a lot that's out there as far as what's going to come. You know, we got the board, we got staffing that's occurring. They're obviously working hard at some of the rules and regs. So some of that specificity as far as the actual licensing, the allocation, the numbers, the canopy, the requirements, all that's going to come from the rules and regs. You know, all we can do is circle back to your point is look at what maybe didn't go so well, you know, and do better, right? When we know better, we do better, hopefully, in the words of Maya Angelou. But I think, you know, Carlos, if there's anything else that you want to add before we wrap up.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that about them. I do have a question. Earlier, we were talking about the type of economic stimulation that the MRTA will be having on New York State. And part of that is job creation. So do you think job creation will play into the regulation formation process? Do you think that we're going to be seeing a lot of jobs? I mean, there's so much to do about permits. You know, the cannabis industry is a diverse and expansive industry where there's more that is needed than just plant touching or retail. There are ancillary businesses. I would love you if you could guys talk a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that a great opportunity for that will be the Incubator Program. You know, I've been learning a little bit about it, and not really things that I can disclose at this moment, but I'm very encouraged by what I'm hearing and setting people up with the right type of education and job placement that will ensure long-term success in good jobs. And we're talking about their commitments in the law to work with unions and to employ a certain number of people within a certain type of operation. I'm specifically very excited about the Incubator Program.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm so excited too. Thank you for sharing that. Kristin, is there anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to clarify. I've seen James suggesting that perhaps I was misspeaking. Absolutely, there is that extra prioritization for impacted people. I thought what you were asking was something different. I thought you were asking about whether or not somebody who checks 5 or 6 boxes will get extra prioritization on top of that. So just want to clarify that.
Thank you for clarifying that, Kristin. And also, you both bring up a good point that on the website, there's definitely a lot of additional information that they are posting. You can subscribe to notifications and, put in your information as to maybe what your intended plans are. But they have a lot of data fact sheets as far as what they're going to be disseminating. So they are a great source of info if you have not gone to that website. I know Dan, I think, put the website link in the chat, I'm pretty sure. But definitely they are a good source. Obviously, they're the ones making the rules and regs. So keep abreast of their, their content. Let's see. So we'll make sure, James, we got that question answered. Are there any other questions that are open?
I think I'm surprised that I'm not seeing any questions about timing. That is the question that everybody seems to want to know and nobody wants to answer. I think a good predictor of what this timing looks like is the hiring. So as we saw on the CCB meeting yesterday, we saw that OCM had approved a hiring of 21 people. And I'm real curious about who those 21 people are and what roles they currently serve. I think the continued hiring of that office is a good indication that we're moving in the right direction, that things are actually moving forward in a real way. I think we'll also start to see, because I believe in that tranche of 21 people was communications and PR individuals. So while we haven't really heard from Chris or Tremaine or any of the other appointees, I think now with those hirings, we're going to see them out talking as much as they can. And so potentially we might be able to hear a little bit more, or at the very least glean some insight into what that process looks like.
I too was encouraged by that. And to your point, it's indicative of movement, where they're going. And if you look at, when it was legalized, in April and now with the new governor and where we're at in the last three weeks to 4 weeks, I mean, that's pretty compelling. They're moving at a good pace. They're lining up the right support, the right stakeholders. They're taking people's feedbacks and inputs, and they're trying, it appears as such, to do the right things right? So it's encouraging. So I'm hopeful that as they fill their staff, that they're working in parallel on the rules and regs, and that they will come out with them in a timely manner. Of course, as Rachel indicated earlier, they have the end of the year to opt out as far as dispensaries, as far as the retail aspect. Again, to add to Kristin's point, if you're interested and want to advocate as well in your town, I think it's important to pay attention to those town hall meetings and, make sure that you're presenting them with adequate and correct information. And I think it helps to look at other states of what they've done well, what they've had to pivot, maybe in California, how they're pivoting in some of their social equity aspects, Florida, and then obviously with Massachusetts, as you denoted. But I think it's important to, look at what people have done, what their lessons are, learn from them, so you can help mitigate, your risk too. And it's important to surround yourself with the Kristins and the Rachels of the world, as far as your, lawyers and accountants and people that know what they're doing to help mitigate some of your overhead and your ramp up costs. So I think it's important. And we're happy to do this with you, because we're all learning things as we hear about rules and regs, and nobody can know it all. I mean, we're hearing things every day and learning things every day. So it's very important, to have that support and participate in your town halls.
And Glenna, to your point about this being nascent and everyone's always learning, I think we also have an opportunity here to show some grace, right? Everyone is trying to figure this out, including our regulators, including our startup organizations like the New York Cannabis Growers and Processors Association. This is all new for everybody. And honestly, we're all just speculating based on the information that we have available to us. We may be wrong, who knows? But we're trying to use the best information that we have to make informed decisions, as everybody is. But I really do think that there's an opportunity here for us to show grace and to understand that this is bumpy, and it's not, we're going to be boiled down in lawsuits regardless of what happens. It's going to happen. We've seen it in every single state. I understand that there's a concern about not having rules for home grow. Look, 2 years ago, we were told not to even move forward with home grow because the governor was never going to pass it. New Jersey doesn't have home grow because they thought that that was something that was an impediment to getting them legalization. I'll be honest with you, for the 8 years of the advocacy work that I've been involved in, that is home grow, home cultivation is a subject that we debate within our advocacy circles. The feeling is, if we have to give up something, maybe it's home grow. But what I've learned and what I hold true from friends like Doug Green, who was a Empire State Normal champion and a champion of this legalization effort for years and is no longer with us, unfortunately. But he was real clear in expressing to me and to others that home grow is not only a right and a privilege, but it is a medicinal necessity for so many people. I have friends who are doctors and lawyers and professionals who swear by a specific strain for their ailment, and currently under our current medical program, nobody knows what strain you're getting. You're either getting a high THC or a low CBD or some combination of those. And so folks who are only able to avail themselves of a medicinal relief or other relief, frankly, for that matter. It's not limited to medicinal relief. It's also for euphoria and for wellness consumption. People should be able to pick and choose which cannabinoids work best for them. I mean, that just makes a whole lot of sense. And if I can't access at my local dispensary sour diesel from a specific strain or what have you, because that's what helps me or makes me feel good, I should be able to grow that. And I think there is a fallacy that is actually something that's easily diverted. Look, I've tried to grow cannabis plants in my windows. It doesn't work. Glenna, you'll tell us. This organization is here to say this is a very specialized part of this industry, a specialized part of this supply chain. And so it's a fallacy to think that folks who are home cultivating are actually going to be able to supply enough source for themselves, much less be diverting it into other areas outside of the regulated program. So I would implore us to again give grace to these regulators who just were appointed. They just appointed the last couple, and they know they have a huge task ahead of them. They know what the priorities are, but let's get people out of jail first. Let's really think about what these priorities should be. Let's stop over policing my neighborhood 20 blocks north of here. Let's make sure that young brown and black men can walk these streets freely and consume cannabis in the same way that I can. So home grow, amen. Licensed regulated industry, let's do it. But let's really think about what the priorities should be here. And if we have to pick and choose what they are and prioritize them, let's bring people home.
Thank you, Kristin, so much.
Wow, Kristin. Yeah, that just grabbed us all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, I know there's a couple students on here that we did a research on different states, and some states are going backwards. The Montanas and the South Dakotas are going backwards. So we are in a great position to collaborate and work together and bring each other up and bring each other through this. And to your point, definitely the priority of expungement and getting people out of jail is paramount. So that was very impactful and fantastic for your honesty and your experience, and whatever we can do to help each other rise up in this space. So thank you.
Rachel and Kristin, thank you so much today for advocating on behalf of small and medium-sized cannabis businesses. It means so much that you took the time to come here and do that for us. We hope to see you again in the near future. We are excited to see what you guys do, how you guys participate, and we will be watching closely.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good night. Thank you, Glenna.
Thanks, you guys. Our pleasure. And we look forward to our next town hall. Take care.
Yes.
Bye, guys.